What's up? Another Talking Heads video for you about Overwatch again. It's been a while since I did the last one, and I'm gonna start cranking them out a little bit more now. I am in the shed as well with this gross thing taking up room in the camera that should be like, you should be able to see my pecs, but you can't, so apologies for that, but hopefully the audio signal should be better. What I'm here to talk about is I'm going to start doing a video series that goes alongside the Over.GG World Rankings, which I write up for the site. It's not just me that actually produces them, but they are an Overwatch. In fact, I think they're the only Overwatch World Rankings article series that aims to look at and divide up the top 10 teams in the world. Now, there's lots of sites that do that in terms of having algorithms that work it out kind of for you. That doesn't make them any better, by the way. In fact, it makes them a lot worse. The fact that somebody isn't subjectively picking doesn't remove any biases because somebody's had to set up the system in the first place and already put in their own kind of way they think it should sift out, and inevitably the numbers don't work, especially within Overwatch where you don't really have that many tournaments. So Ghosty Gamers do this and have done for a long time. Plusforward.net do that as well. I really like that site as well, and as far as I know it doesn't get much attention, so check those guys out. And now Over.GG have started doing it as well. If I can work the magic, I might bring that up on screen at some point, but I wasn't intending to, so I probably won't be able to work the magic. It is literally magic. So Over.GG/rankings is the algorithmic method that Over.GG has implemented. It's an ELO based system, but we're carrying on with our own subjective ones. Myself, Admirable, and Harsha are the team that produce them, and then I kind of collect the data and help them decide, and then I write out the reasoning behind it as well. But I think that something that's also been lacking has been a breakdown of the top teams within a region, which makes much more sense, really, than the world rankings do, because it's always difficult, especially in Overwatch, where teams tend not to play that much or that frequently outside of their own region. Tournaments like IMKyangi, Apex, obviously, I think you'd have to go back to the Overwatch Open and like the Atlantic Showdown to get a proper mix of regional talent. Otherwise, you're just kind of relying on individual teams, maybe just deciding to take the leap over to North America to try and bridge the gap between the regions, which isn't a very good way at all of trying to decide where teams really fit in a global rankings. So definitely something that's required is just to start kind of a basics and see where teams rack up within their region. So that's what I'm going to do. This is the purpose of this video, is to give you guys an idea of the current tiers of rankings. So I'm not going to rank them 1 to 10 or 1 down to 20 or however many teams I decide to include. I'm just going to lump them into groups. And I wrote an article about this ages ago. You can find it on Over.GG if you can be bothered. But it's about the tier system, and a lot of esports analysts use this idea. And the basic premise of it, which is why I've called it the salty tiers ranking, is that you're ranking teams into groups that you think would be very competitive and at roughly kind of the same level within the group. So that they take games off each other, they run each other really close, they show maybe one team's like the boogie team to another team, so it always gets the better end of them, but there's like an A beats B and B beats C, but C beats A kind of rock, paper, scissors aspect to it in that kind of sense. So there's something extra going on rather than just being a class above. And I think tiers in general end up fitting esports teams particularly better than straight rankings. I think listing a team 1 to 10 very numerically is a very human construct that you can't really fit onto things that have their own life, like teams when they compete, and the different runs that they make in different tournaments and how they can sometimes appear good and sometimes appear be in a slump and stuff. It feels very artificial to try and literally rank them from 1 to 10, as in this 9th best team is better than this 10th best team, when they could be broadly similar. So the tiers system then. I'm going to do it for the 3 regions which I'm most comfortable with as well, which is North America, Europe, and Korea. I do watch the Chinese games on occasion, and I watch the games of Blank, AHQ, Flash Wolves, those guys over in the Overwatch Pacific Championship as well in Southeast Asia, kind of that kind of region as well. But I'm not too comfortable with those regions. Certainly not comfortable enough to draw up tiers where I would go down below tier 1 anyway. And what's the point in listing? Well, I guess there's a little bit of a point in listing tier 1, but I'm not going to do it anyway, so go and do it yourself. So instead, I'm going to do the 3 major regions for Overwatch. And I would love to put some stuff on the screen for you, but I'm just not technologically capable. So instead, just go and do something else and listen to me in the background as I whittle on. I'm going to start with North America, though. It's the region that most of the fans are going to be the most familiar with, I think is the best way of putting it. Not just because the fan base is there and there's a lot of infrastructure there, there's a lot of tournaments as well that run fairly regularly, so you get a good sense of how teams sift out on top of each other. And so, broadly speaking, I think there's... I'm going to run through kind of the top 3 tiers in each region. Once you drop below that, you kind of get way too muddy to be able to tell. So, North America. The top 3... Oh, and again, another note. I feel like I'm adding tons of caveats before I've even got into the meat of this video. The other thing is that for teams like Rogue, who've played in North America and have now moved over to Korea, I'm actually including them in both because I think it's relevant to include them in discussions of both. So that'll be the same for EnVyUs and teams such as that. So for North America, the tier 1 at the moment, in the middle of May, drifting back using the results for the past couple of months or so, has got to be Rogue, EnVyUs, and Selfless. This is fairly well defined, I think, and it bears out if you look at the data of how the tournaments have run over the past couple of months. Ever since Rogue made the switch to bring Nico into the team, apart from when they've gone over to Apex and now lost to Kongdoo Panthera, they were unbeaten. They were coming up against the North American teams. Essentially, everyone was throwing everything they could at them. The playbook against their triple DPS and occasionally 2-2-2 strategies that they run with Nico and D.Va instead. And it wasn't working. They had incredible consistency when they played in North America. Very clearly, there is not even an argument to be made against it that they were the best team, because not only did they wipe the floor with all of the kind of domestic teams that play regularly within North America, but then in the rivalcade, they even matched up against EnVyUs and managed to best them in 2 separate best of 3s. I think the final one was actually best of 5, but they had a single game advantage, something like that. But anyway, it was fairly conclusive. They are the best team in the region. In a sense, they could even exist in a tier of their own because none of the teams have actually taken series off them. But they have been pushed, I would say, almost to the limit, as in one tiny mistake from them or one extra tiny mistake, and they would have lost a series against EnVyUs and Selfless. So I think you can safely put them within the tier 1 alongside EnVyUs and Selfless. So Rogue, Envy, and Selfless are my tier 1 for North America. Selfless are kind of the things to mention here, the things of relevance, are that EnVyUs have only played 1 tournament in this time period with this roster that they've come back with, having left Internet Hulk, shipped him off to France, or rather Korea, with Rogue, and they've now brought Louis in effect into the roster. They were playing with Louis in the Rumble. They had a very good showing there. They beat Selfless, managed to take 2nd place. Although they kind of got smacked by Rogue in the first best of 3, they did come back and had a really competitive game with them towards the end. So definitely, I think, although the data is very minimal, that's not something you can really complain too much about, given that it's Overwatch. Data tends to be fairly minimal anyway. There aren't really that many tournaments happening all the time. Certainly not something like CS, where these things are happening fairly with any kind of regularity. So you have to really cling to the data wherever you can get it. So I think EnVyUs deserve their spot there, especially given the caliber of the team beforehand as well. You would expect them to be able to rumble with these kind of guys. Selfless, I think, also deserve their spot in tier 1. They've had very good consistency against the other teams that are below them. They've also run Rogue consistently the closest out of any of the other North American teams. They have some fantastic star individual talent. And now with Rogue and EnVyUs gone, I would expect this to be their time to really dominate North America. They have, more so than Rogue and EnVyUs, certainly more so than Rogue, looked like they're capable of being upset by other teams in tier 2 though. My tier 2 for North America is Cloud9, Immortals, and LG Evil. These 3 to me are 3 of kind of, they're roughly around the same level of team. LG Evil really started to make a big name for themselves when they were dominating the Carbon series, although they'd had good performances before that. And Immortals were in a little bit of a slump at that point, having just kind of peaked a little bit for the end of Winter Premiere. where they absolutely flew through that tournament. And then they peaked again towards the end of the Carbon series. So they seem to have a very nice structure within their team as well, where they're really bringing out the big performances for the big tournaments. They were complaining a little bit of, burnout. So they actually declined an invitation to Apex as well, which was reported by Harsher a while back. And they seem to have a very interesting and, I don't want to call it unique, but it's certainly an infrequent ability within Overwatch so far to peak at the right times and be able to revive out of a slump. A lot of teams, once they go into a slump, be it for whatever reason, often due to patches, never really recover. And Immortals definitely have shown that they can to some degree. Once the big dogs came back to play, though, Immortals and LG Evil certainly were put into second fiddle position. In the recent tournaments where Rogue and Selfless have been playing, they have been coming like third, fourth. They've had top finishes in all of the tournaments though, and have looked good, apart from the Cyber Power where they were upset, where Immortals were upset by CLG. But in general, these two teams, along with Cloud9's appearances when they came back from Apex and started to reform their roster, have looked very solid, and they've all looked very competitive with each other as well. LG Evil, when they made the run through Cyber Power, had a crazy game against Cloud9 that was just so close. And you've got to imagine that if Immortals were able to get through that first game against CLG as well, which was incredibly close, that all of these teams would have been pretty much on par with each other. They can also kind of take upsets of Selfless occasionally, but Selfless have actually had a really good consistency at beating them down over the course of the last couple of months, which is why Selfless are in tier 1 and these guys are in tier 2. My tier 3 is... The main characteristic for my tier 3 in North America is the ability to either get upsets or have very consistent results against the rest of the field. But mostly it's based on upsets against the top teams. Because if you can, with any regularity, start to upset the real elite teams, not when they're in a slump, but actually when they've previously been taking like really deep runs in tournaments, been able to consistently beat teams, if you're beating them on that kind of footing, then you're doing very well, and you're going to make a name for yourself. You're going to start looking like you've got some real potential. So Liquid is the first one to talk about here. I'll give you my whole tier 3 for starters, though. It's Liquid, YIKES, who used to be ex-Denial, CLG, Evil Geniuses, and Rise Nation as well. There are a couple of teams that you could potentially put in there, but don't really have enough results to justify it, or haven't quite had the upset results to be able to put in that tier, I think. So I'm going to keep my tier 3 fairly exclusive for now. Liquid had a really nice upset over Selfless in the Pit Championship NA to come second place. I thought that was very impressive from them. They look to have improved massively since adding Shadow2K to the roster as well. For some reason, which I'm not quite sure why, it seems to have properly unlocked the skills of ID and AZK as well. Particularly AZK, which is a weird one, because previously I don't feel like he wasn't given enough space or resources or anything, but certainly with Shadow2K now at the kind of at the forefront of how they're building their compositions, where they've got a very good triple DPS going on and frequently flex ID over to Defara as well. They've got a nice system where a lot of pressure is taken away from AZK and he can actually flourish within that. And I'm going back a little bit when I'm talking about Liquid's real looking like they're up and coming, but they also haven't played that recently as well with that kind of performance. So they're looking very good. YIKES Denial had the run where they were playing with Silk Thread as well, where they looked really promising, took some good results. I believe they upset Immortals, I think, and generally looked like they could be a very good team that was up and coming. They're kind of on par with Evil Geniuses for me. But there's more of a question mark as to who they get for that 6th player. I don't believe it's actually been announced yet. Oh, actually, I think it has. And it was Space, a guy that I'm not really familiar with and haven't caught Denial's games, YIKES games since they added him. But it'll be interesting to see whether they can have the same kind of performances, since I thought that Silk Thread was actually a really good player for that team and seemed to be... I thought it was more than just a coincidence that when they were playing with Silk Thread, they had that fantastic performance. And he is a really talented guy in his own right. The other two teams are CLG and Rise Nation. Rise are on the lower end of this tier 3 for sure. They're more of like a stable team that when they're playing well can contest the top teams, but they haven't had that many upset results against them. And certainly on their bad days, they can look like they're pretty trash actually. But I think Rise Nation deserve to be in there. CLG much more so actually recently. They've looked like a really promising team. They have a composition that works super well for them as well, where they run the Pharah Mercy alongside the Tracer as well. And they have a nice setup with that composition. It fits their strengths. It's a very powerful composition at the moment as well. They have certain maps where it really works well for them. And of course, they upset Immortals in the quarterfinals. They also had some really good results against CLG previously. Some very tight games with a lot of these top teams. Sorry, against Selfless, not CLG. They are CLG, obviously. So this is my tier 3 for North America. Teams that potentially, now that Rogue and EnVyUs are out of the picture, could start making breaks for themselves, could start really improving. So there's a lot of promise at the moment, actually, within the North American scene. I think it gets a bit of a bad rep, kind of ported over from other esports, that North America is a bit of a joke region, especially because the European teams that have come over, like Rogue and EnVyUs, have dominated pretty much. Like EnVyUs have right from when they first moved over, and Rogue, now that they moved over, have done pretty much the same. But certainly this tier 2 isn't as far away as you might think from the top teams. Cloud9, Immortals, LG Evil, these are not teams to be sniffed about. Sniffed on? Sniffed? Sniffed at. That's the phrase. So North America's looking reasonably good. It's got some rising talent as well. Teams that you don't quite know where they're going to sort out. Fnatic we haven't seen in a while, and actually their run in the Overwatch multi-melee was when they had still Vonethil and Hafikool. Hafikool and Vonethil both playing with over 100 ping because they're not at a team house or anything. As a result, having very poor performances, or perhaps not as a result, but certainly added on to that, they were having poor performances. They've made some changes to their roster. Now, I think that there's been rumors that Tailspin will be sticking with the team, though it was reported, in fact, that they were trialing somebody else as well. Reels, I don't believe, is sticking with the team, but we'll see how that one works out. And of course, the organization has dropped them as well, so we'll see how that affects the team in the future. FaZe are another team that we don't really have enough of a read on, mostly because they're split completely across the regions, and they have had a history within that team of peaking offline performances, but they've only really had 2 of those, so you can't draw too many conclusions from that. You can't keep giving them a pass based on their ping forever. Renegades are another team that will be interesting to see where they match up, but we don't know as of yet. So there's my tiers for North America. Tier 1, Rogue, EnVyUs, Selfless. Tier 2 at the moment is Cloud9, Immortals, and LG Evil. I think those are fairly inarguable, actually. Those seem fairly set in stone. Tier 3, I've got Liquid, YIKES, CLG, Evil Geniuses, Rise. Much more debatable, admittedly. But I think it's fair assessment to pop those in tier 3. Now, if we cast our eyes over to Europe, I'll do Europe next and then Korea. Europe's quite an interesting one. I certainly enjoy watching the European games because there's a feeling like it's a bit of undiscovered talent at the moment. A lot of the fan base and viewer base is kind of centered around the North American teams, because that's where the tournaments in general are happening. That's where most of the fan base, which is North American, ends up watching. The tournaments that do happen in Europe, for example, the recent Take TV Takeover 2 qualifiers, were only broadcast in German, and so only got a viewership of about 1,000 to 2,000, and were actually really sick games that happen. So there's a sense that you're getting something that other people aren't, which is always fun when you're watching Europe. But I think the tiers in Europe are less well defined as well. The meta keeps shifting more quickly than in other regions, it seems. I don't know whether that's really... See, I don't know whether you can say that they're really at the forefront of the meta as well, because they seem to be very specifically tailoring it against certain teams. But certainly in the past, this region has been where the metagame has been developed and then ported out to elsewhere and refined elsewhere as well, particularly in Korea. But the European teams like NIP was one of the first to pioneer, well, was the first to pioneer the tank meta, which was then kind of widened out and saw its peak. First started to see it peak in the Overwatch Open, where there was a counter strategy developed, and then later carried on with the Diva meta Soldier. And the triple DPS is another thing that's been exported from Europe, with eUnited and Rogue running it a lot. Rogue really made it famous, but a lot of the European teams call it the eUnited comp, so I'm not sure who really first started it, but I think it's one of those 2 teams. Within Europe, the tiers that I've got currently, First of all, in Tier 1, you have to put in Movistar Riders and ex-Cyclone. These two teams have been tearing it up recently. Movistar Riders have looked like they're slightly the better end of both of those two teams. They came out with a win in the Pit Championship EU. They lost the game to Misfits to put them second in the group stage. But then they stormed through the playoffs, the double elimination playoffs. They didn't lose a game. They ended up beating NIP in the top, and then they beat eUnited just to send them straight into the grand final, and then beat eUnited again once they came back up. Lots of very close games, but they did look like absolute masters of the triple DPS composition that, as I was saying, eUnited really helped pioneer. So if you can beat the originators, I guess, then you're certainly doing something right. Ex-Cyclone are another team that has had a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of hype actually, but certainly the people who have been in the know, or you would expect to know a lot about the European scene, have really been trying to big these guys up, because they're definitely the strongest team currently without an organization within Overwatch, I would say. I don't know whether you can ever really say that someone deserves a team, deserves an organization, but if you can, then they definitely do. So ex-Cyclone have been winning a huge amount of kind of the go for Overwatch competitions, which do get quite a number of the top teams in Europe playing in them because of the lack of tournaments. They also got first place in the first Takeover 2 qualifier, beat Hammers in the final, but Hammers actually knocked out Movistar Riders, so you didn't see the clash there. Movistar Riders also won the HND Invitational, which was another big Europe, well, it's big in terms of the teams that it attracts, it's not big in terms of the prize pool, but it's a big European tournament that both teams were competing in. Both teams made the final, and Movistar beat them 3-1. In a previous Go for Overwatch monthly final, I believe it was February, ex-Cyclone beat Movistar Riders 3-0. So these two teams seem to be roughly, in terms of both their head-to-head matchups and the things that they've won within the scene, relatively on par. But ex-Cyclone got upset in the Pit EU qualifiers and therefore weren't really able to demonstrate their level there. They got upset in a best of one. So in overall, Movistar Riders look to have the edge if you're looking based on the data and their head-to-head matchups. Most recently, Movistar Riders have won. The other two teams that I would put in the tier 1, although they look a level, just not really a full level, but a little bit below Movistar and ex-Cyclone, are eUnited and Dignitas. But Dignitas have now dropped their team. Like, the organization has dropped the team, it was reported by me a couple of days ago, and has just been confirmed by Dignitas actually as well. So the team is expected to also break up or rebuild with a few components different. So although they deserve to be in the tier 1 at the moment, I think, based on their results in Pit Championship EU, their results before that weren't too great, and they had kind of a lightning run through the lower bracket, knocking out NIP, Misfits, running eUnited incredibly close, almost could have made a grand finals appearance. So definitely they have the results within that tournament to justify a placing in tier 1. They haven't played in too many tournaments to really round out their portfolio, and they've also dropped and they're not a team anymore. So if you want to discount them from the tier 1, you certainly can. Be my guest. eUnited are the other team that belong in there, though. They've been a team that have been performing well ever since they came back from Apex. They were playing in Korea for quite a while, came back and began with a really powerful showing in a Strive Wire. I think that was February that they ended up winning. Again, had a really strong showing in the Pit Championship for EU. Hopefully, they'll be invited to Takeover 2 as well, alongside Movistar Riders and ex-Cyclone, and we can really see how they match up. But Movistar got the better end of them twice in the Pit Championship EU as well. But broadly speaking, I believe that they're sufficiently far above the teams that I have in Tier 2 at the moment, or have demonstrated that so far, that they belong in Tier 1 rather than Tier 2. The Tier 2 teams that I've got in Europe are where I think there's a distinction kind of between the very top teams. These teams that have potential, or if there were more tournaments, could actually, you would see them maybe go into the Tier 1. But certainly don't belong in Tier 3. And these three teams are Hammers, Misfits, and NIP. So Misfits and NIP are two giants of the European scene. Misfits have been around for ages. They had a very different roster though before they went all Swedish. They then competed at IEM Kyangi, then in Apex Season 2, and now they've come back to compete in Europe. IEM Kyangi and Apex Season 2, they ended up really not getting wins against elite teams, but running them pretty close. In the PID Championship EU, they destroyed their group to start with and beat Movistar Riders and Dignitas, both teams that I've currently got in Tier 1, but then failed to perform in the playoffs when it actually mattered. When teams had perhaps sussed them out a little bit or modified their style to go up against Misfits, who don't quite play the same as the other European teams, tend more towards the kind of tanks or more traditional compositions with Zarya and Roadhog, etc. They came up lacking. Now, if you run them in more tournaments against the European teams, it's very possible that they would end up in Tier 1. They have the talent on the roster. They demonstrated it in the past. Each player individually can hit those peaks, but they haven't demonstrated it so far within the European competition, and they haven't actually participated in that many tournaments. Plus, they were kind of lackluster when they went up against the Korean teams, even though they played against some pretty deadly teams. They played Lunatic-Hai at IEM Kyangi, if memory serves, and then they played Lunatic-Hai and AF.Blue in Apex Season 2, which was utterly ridiculous. Thanks for seeding that tournament, and then doing almost the exact same again with Rogue in this season. And then NIP have been on a bit of a downswing. They, again, are a team that have kind of legendary status within the scene, but haven't showed it for a long time since really... Well, have they ever showed it? That's an argument that you could definitely make. They've always been a team that people have been scared to take on, certainly in online competition. They absolutely smashed it towards the latter end of 2016. They were obliterating people before coming into DreamHack. At DreamHack themselves, they kind of flopped as they had flopped at Overwatch Open. That is to say that they had put all their cards on the table, kind of offered up themselves as the best team, the team to beat, and teams were deliberately anti-stratting them and ended up not performing as well at the LAN as they were online, ended up flopping. Same thing, well, not the same thing, but the same end result happened in the PID Championship EU, where they dropped a match, the first one that they played against Kittenz, so they probably shouldn't have, ended up coming first in their group anyway, but then got beaten twice in the playoffs to end up going out fairly early, actually, to Dignitas. Hammers are the other team that I haven't discussed. They've been a team that have been on the rise for a while. They kind of looked their best when they were competing in the triple tank meta. Certainly were a team to watch out for at that point and would have been in the tier 1 at that time had I done these kind of rankings. But at the moment, they've just made a switch to their roster. They've let go of their off-tank Sev, and they've switched Snizzlenose, who was their DPS Roadhog player. They've switched him to take over some more of the off-tank duties, playing a lot more triple DPS, whereas previously they would pretty much only play triple tank, and they're starting to find success. They upset Movistar Riders in a crazy 3-2 game, Takeover 2 first qualifier, and then made it to the finals of the second qualifier, but were beaten 3-0 by Movistar Riders there. So kind of didn't have quite the same performance. Weren't able to pull out the magic a second time. I think they definitely belong in tier 2, but they do belong in tier 2, if you know what I mean. They belong in tier 2 as in they're better than the tier 3 teams, but they belong in tier 2 as in they're not at the moment on the same level as the tier 1 team. So for different reasons than Misfits and NIP, though. But they've had similar kind of results. The tier 3 for Europe is Kittenz, Vivi's Adventure, Team Expert, Team Singularity Ninjas, and Thonkers. Now, there's a lot of teams in here, mostly because it's not just about who's been taking upsets against the top teams, because not that many people have. It's more about which teams have been making consistent deep dives in tournaments, whilst also looking like they have the caliber to contest the top teams as well. Kittenz have got upset results against NIP and potentially a couple of the others as well. They've been looking relatively good. They've got some star individual talent on their team. Krems has been impressive, actually, on Flex, as a guy that I wasn't too familiar with before he joined that team. They have a lot of other notable talent on the team as well, including Kib. Vivi's Adventure and Team Expert are both kind of... Team Expert were formerly known as Alternate Attacks, played with them for a while. They've now brought in 2 Norwegian players and are living in Germany in a team house, a Team Experts team house. Both of these 2 teams proficient in triple DPS dive, but not to the level where they can consistently compete against the top tier teams. They had reasonable results in the tournaments that we've seen come up recently, and they look like with a couple of alterations or more consistency, then they could certainly start to get into the tier 2. But for now, they have been beaten and have inconsistency against other kind of tier 3 teams so much that I don't think you can really place them higher. Same kind of thing with Team Singularity Ninjas, actually, but this team is more of a well-rounded team, but doesn't particularly excel in any area, and that is hurting them a little bit. And Thonkers are the full Swedish team that recently got dropped by Red Reserve, and I think they belong in kind of the same area as well. UB team, UB, are a Italian team that probably belong around the same level, but they've only been playing scrims and only recently took part in the Takeover 2 qualifiers, so I haven't had enough time to really watch them and look at their level. I've only really seen them in 2 qualifiers, one of which I think they got knocked out in the round of 16 or something by a reasonably good team. And then in the second one, they had a deep run and managed to get to, I think it was the semi-finals, but I don't think there's enough data there to accurately place them in anywhere. For Misfits and NiP as well, I'll be looking to see how they perform at Takeover 2, which is going to be a stacked tournament. This tournament is going to be ridiculous. You've got NiP, Misfits, Movistar Riders, ex-Cyclone, eUnited, well, potentially eUnited. They haven't been announced yet, but they dropped out of the qualifier at the last second, which makes me think they're probably going to be the next thing to be announced. So there's 5 fat teams already, assuming eUnited gets announced. Rogue have also been announced, coming over from Korea. So that doesn't really matter who they announce for the last 2 slots. This is already going to be a stacked tournament that's super interesting to watch. So, as we're dragging on a bit, let's have a look at Korea. The teams that Korea's an interesting one because in the off-season between Apexes, you have a lot of really rapid roster shuffles as teams aim to shore up their weaknesses and really expand on their strengths. And then you also often have changes in the meta, and that's certainly happened this season. A lot of these teams have made shifts. Lunatic-Hai tried to bring in Munchkin and Claris, failed epically due to their fans, ended up having to bring in Guido, I don't actually know how to pronounce that guy's name. Panthera dropped 2 of their players, Bling and Fisher. Bling being their Lucio player, and Fisher their main tank. They moved Waka Waka, their previous DPS player, over to Lucio, and they brought in wait, what am I talking about? They didn't lose Fisher. Did they lose Bling? Wait, am I going mad? They bring in Void, or they move Fisher to the bench? Hey, I'm going crazy. What happened with that team? I know the roster that they've got currently. No, they didn't drop Fisher. What am I talking about? They dropped somebody else. Who was their old off tank? Oh, of course, Butcher. Man, I'm an idiot. Of course they dropped Butcher. They dropped Butcher, who was previously, obviously, this 5k Roadhog star. And brought in Birdring from Kongdoo Uncia. So they now have possibly the deadliest DPS combo in the whole of Apex in terms of these guys' versatility, what they can bring to the table, just the sheer execution that they also bring. Rascal and Birdring, fantastic. They've also picked up Void on off-tank, who can facilitate a triple DPS comp with his Soldier 76, which is pretty good. It's not too bad. It's not really at the elite level, but it's pretty good. And his Diva's good as well. Very solid. So they've got a nice team structure going on. LW.Blue also brought in Pine, which other teams made changes. AF.Blue also made pretty significant changes. RunAway made changes. So a lot of these teams made shifts and the metas change. So my tier 1 for Korea at the moment, bearing in mind that Apex may change this as we go on, as it would with every other region as well. But for now, my tier 1 for Korea is Lunatic-Hai, Kongdoo Panthera, Luxury Watch Blue, and Rogue. And now the interesting thing from this tier 1, for me, when I was thinking about it and arguing with myself, is that I have Rogue and EnVyUs in the tier 1 of North America, Rogue, EnVyUs, and Selfless, and yet I've somehow justified to myself that Rogue and EnVyUs should be split between Tier 1 and Tier 2 when you consider them playing in Korea. The reasoning for this is that North America's got a larger skill gap, I feel, between its teams. And so, even though Rogue potentially could be in like a tier of their own within North America, it makes more sense, I think, to lump them in with EnVyUs and Selfless. But the gap between those three teams is relatively large, because Rogue have got the better end of both of those two teams whenever they've faced off, and they've faced off against Selfless many times, actually. So, I think it's reasonable to say that for the moment, given what we've seen of EnVyUs, which admittedly is almost nothing, it's a single tournament with their new roster, they belong in Tier 2 for now. But certainly if we see some promising results and a level of coordination and individual talent, then they could definitely move up into Tier 1 as well. But the Tier 2 itself is super strong within Korea. It just speaks to the depth of talent within the region. So my Tier 1 again: Lunatic-Hai, Kongdoo, Panthera, Luxury-Watch-Blue, and Rogue. Lunatic-Hai won last season of Apex. They've come into this season. They beat Kongdoo, Panthera. They're looking on track to probably beat Rogue as well and knock them out. But they could potentially still get knocked out of the group. What you'll also see from my tier system here is that I personally am crying many salty tears, because 3/4 of my Tier 1 for Korea are in one group, which means that only 2 of them can exit. So one of Lunatic-Hai, Panthera, or Rogue is going home. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be Rogue, but we'll see how that one plays out. But I think that Rogue, despite losing to Kongdoo, Panthera, who also lost to Lunatic-Hai, and don't really have the stylistic differences to say that they would fare far better against Lunatic-Hai. I think Rogue played so closely with Kongdoo, Panthera, and have shown a level of form that has been roughly equivalent to the Korean teams, that they should be also considered in this Tier 1. They are a fantastic team. You look at their individual skill, you look at their cohesion, what they've been able to bring out just with a single composition that has changed people's approaches whenever they have had to play against them. You're always playing Rogue's game whenever you're playing against Rogue. You're playing to their pace, you're playing against their aggressive style, you're having to force shifts in how you think about the game and how you're preparing strategies against them. So I think they definitely belong in the Tier 1, even if they end up getting eliminated. But that applies to Lunatic-Hai and Panthera as well. These two teams are looking fantastic. Panthera, with their recent changes, are looking godly. They're looking really, really solid. And the fact that Lunatic-Hai were able to come back and beat them in the end 3-2 speaks volumes to what they've been able to do in terms of really settling their mentality as they come into these big games. The other team that I've got in my Tier 1 is Luxury-Watch-Blue. And I think that the addition of Pine and Sylph to the roster really nicely fits into the areas where there were question marks before with this roster of LW-Blue, and is going to give them a bit of added punch to be able to get through and really have a deeper run than they did last time. And considering they got 3rd last time, that's a pretty good going. Coming into the tournament, they were my favorite to take it in the end, but that was kind of just because A, I hadn't seen how good Kongdoo Panthera looked with their new DPS duo, and B, when I was doing that article with Radon, you kind of had to think about what patch changes would come up as well, and Luxury-Watch-Blue are very versatile. I think they can adapt to the patches pretty well, but they're certainly an elite team as well. My second tier in Korea is EnVyUs, which I talked about a little bit before. We haven't seen too much of those. If they perform at the caliber where they were in the finals of the Rivalcade Rumble, and looking back on their previous form and teamwork and the individual talent that they bring to this team and how they incorporate Louis in effect, if they manage to make that work, then they could even make stretches towards Tier 1, I think. They've also got time to work on that because they're almost guaranteed to get into the playoffs. They would have to properly butcher their group. Even if they lose the Meta Athena and end up placing like 2nd overall in the group, that's not really a problem. They're going to go into the quarterfinals anyway. I think they would have to really blow something. They're up against BK Stars and... who's the other team there? Let me check for a moment. BK Stars and Rhinos Gaming Wings. Okay, that's why I couldn't think of them, because they're really not a top team at all. So they should be able to just waltz into the playoffs, and that'll give them more time to work on their team play and how they're incorporating Luyan effect into the roster as well. The other three teams I've got: AF.Blue, Meta Athena, RunAway. So AF.Blue have made changes to their flex support, like the Ana Zen player. Always never really found a good term, by the way, to describe this Ana Zen kind of player within the team. The best one that I ever found was flex support, which is what I now use and has now become kind of common within the scene, I think, or at least used to some degree. But I don't actually like that, basically because often when you move a player away from the support role, it's the Lucio. So your hard support or your main support ends up being the one that flexes over to the Torbjorn or over to the whatever you end up playing in the first place. A lot of teams though do flex their Ana over to like a Soldier 76 if they're running a Solar Heal comp or a Sombra or something. But it's still not a great way. Maybe it should be like DPS support or something. I don't know. I'll leave that to you guys to come up with a good one. But AF.Blue changed. They brought in Lucid, and they also switched Mano, who was their previous support player, over to tank. The synergy that those two guys have built up has been excellent, and it really has facilitated Arhan to play his style again. I think it was Radon wrote an article about Arhan being the guy who's really got to step up or step down at the moment from AF.Blue. He is the guy that they've always structured the team around, even when things weren't going so well, even when he wasn't particularly playing so well, even when the support structure wasn't there to give him all the... Well, they always did give him the resources, but the resources weren't good enough for him to play that style, because their main tank player on Winston wasn't great, and neither was their flex support player. Like, their Ana wasn't good enough to keep him... to really time the heals and make sure that the monkey was healthy when they're going in for dives and making sure they got that real good synergy between them. But now that they've made those changes, AF.Blue are looking like a scary team. They're looking like they could potentially cause upsets against the tier 1 of Korea, and they really haven't looked like that since before Apex Season 1, maybe. Like before Apex Season 1, where they were considered the top team along with Luxury Watch Red back in like early Overwatch. And even in Apex Season 1, they had flashes of that kind of form, but nothing that they could really hold on to. So far in Apex, having beaten RunAway and X6, they look like they're back to that level again. RunAway, the circumstances surrounding their loss to AF.Blue, plus the fact that they had brought in a new player to the team and looked like they didn't have a clue what was going on, I'm going to give them a pass and still put them in Tier 2. I'm not going to read too much into that single result, but it must be said that RunAway are certainly a team that over the course of Apex I had in my initial article to slip the furthest out of any of the teams that people would consider good teams in Korea. I feel like right from when you were watching them play towards the end of Apex Season 2, when they had the amazing run through the playoffs, it seemed like they were working on some magical element, some fairy dust that they found in a closet that was at every point it looked like it had run out, and they just found a sliver more. Someone sneezed and more fairy dust came out of their nose that had just been trapped in their hairs, and suddenly the team was able to come out with a clutch again and win it. But I think the fairy dust has well and truly run out for RunAway in that kind of sense, in the sense that they're going to be able to make the finals and potentially win again. I think that was a once in a roster kind of achievement for them. Whether or not they can still be a solid Tier 2 team remains to be seen, because if they continue with the kind of performance that they showed against AF.Blue, that is not going to happen. They structured all of their compositions around this new guy that came into the roster, Mirage. I don't really know too much of the background behind him. As far as I'm aware, he didn't really play in any other notable team. I could be wrong, actually. But I don't think... He didn't play in an Apex team, as far as I'm aware. Certainly not in a... on the star role where you would be building all your compositions around him, but he flexed from everything. He started on Winston, moved over to Diva, played some Pharah, even played Ana at some point. He was playing Soldier 76. All the time they were working their compositions around him. Even when they added Kaiser back into the team, they were still working around Mirage. Really strange kind of game plan to have coming into it when he didn't demonstrate any qualities of being a superstar player like you would want to completely rebuild a team that came second place in Apex around. Not sure what they're doing there. Maybe that was to do with the reports that came, or the rumors that came up afterwards. The team was suffering from the flu or something, and some certain players were unwell. Certainly RunAway could rebound from this, but we'll see where they end up slipping or raising over the coming weeks, months in Apex. Meta Athena are the other team that I think belong in tier 2. Certainly towards the end of Apex, they looked like they had a real big weakness against the dive teams. They're a very tactical team. They work best when they're going in against, say, they play a 2-2-2 or a tank composition themselves. They started out Apex Season 2 where they're putting a lot of resources into Hoon and really destroying the front line of a lot of these teams. Then they played a very tactical kind of flanking or innovative style where they're opening up different angles and really surprising their opponents. But this worked at its best when you're playing against reactive triple tank compositions who are waiting and trying to just poke you down and work the Reinhardt shields and stuff. It doesn't really work when you're playing against dive at all. And now that the pace has just increased up to like 12 in this season of Apex, I don't think Meta Athena have what it takes so far that they've demonstrated to be able to hang with the elite. Happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think that Meta Athena belong there at the moment. Certainly, I think a solid tier 2 team for now. Tier 3 are kind of your upset teams, or the teams that are good teams, could potentially make something happen in Apex, but are likely to either fail to make the quarterfinals or to go out in the quarterfinals. These teams are CONBOX Spirit, a team that plays around their Sombra quite a lot, certainly has some upset potential because they play a very kind of unique and variable upset heavy style. BK Stars, solid team with quite a bit of teamwork and some players who have previously shown that they have what it takes to compete against the best, but haven't really been able to string it together into any meaningful results. X6 Gaming, who have come up from Super Week, from Challenger. They were the #1 team in Challenger. They came through Super Week, #1 team in Super Week. Have come into a reasonably difficult, I would say the second most difficult group. Certainly got a potential to be able to exit in second, but that would involve them upsetting RunAway, which is, I don't know, that's reasonable for them. They could do it, but I don't think they're a team that belongs any higher than tier 3 at the moment, like a potential upset team. Their performance so far hasn't blown me away. This isn't a Meta Athena part 2, I don't think, unless they rapidly improve from here on out. Kongdoo Uncia, I think, also have slipped down from being a potential tier 1, tier 2 team last season to being a tier 3 team at the moment, having lost Birdring, their primary carry for this team, and switched Dance over to the support as well. Kongdoo Uncia have not looked great. They lost to X6 Gaming. They don't really look like they have what it takes anymore. Perhaps reading too much into a single result, but all things considered, I don't think I really am. Mighty AOD, I think, also belong in this group. They're a team that are likely just to get absolutely smacked and end up out of the tournament 3-0 like Afrika Freaks Red last season, where they were in the group of death. But they are a reasonably good team. You can look back at their online performances, look back at their results in the Challenger Series. This is a team that occasionally gets upsets against really notable teams, that has good runs in online tournaments, and that, if was in any other group, could have had a shot at getting the quarterfinals. Will have no shot in this group because they're up against 3 teams that are in tier 1. The 4th tier is the only one that I've done for Korea, but mainly just because these guys are competing in Apex. Just to highlight that the 3 worst teams currently competing in Apex for my money are, and the 3 teams that have a level below them from the rest are Rhino Gaming Wings, MVP Space, and Flash Lux. I think this tier is certainly the most arguable in Korea because the talent pool is so deep within the teams that even these teams can end up having decent results, certainly against tier 3, occasionally even decent results, or running teams in tier 2 pretty close. So even though I do think that RG Wings, MVP Space, and Flash Lux are at the bottom, and MVP Space actually 3-0'd Flash Lux recently in their game as well, so there's differences within these tiers as well. But these are the teams I expect to do absolutely nothing and really not have too much of a chance within Apex. So there are my tiers for North America, Europe, and Korea for the 16th. Oh, well, it was the 15th of May when I started this, but I've been going on so long that it's now the 16th of May. Good God, I should stop waffling. Jesus Christ.